James Palmer, a self-made millionaire whose name commanded respect in boardrooms and exclusive clubs alike, sat in his study, a crystal tumbler of scotch in one hand, a pen in the other. His brow was furrowed, not from the weight of business decisions that usually occupied his mind, but from something far more personal and far more permanent. For months, James had struggled with an internal conflict that he had never imagined he would face. The life he had built with his wife, Elizabeth, once filled with promise and excitement, now felt like a burden. The commitments, the routine, the expectations, it all felt suffocating. He had tasted success, wealth, and power, but with it had come the gnawing sense that there was something more out there for him, something untethered by the obligations of marriage, something that promised the thrill and freedom he hadn't felt in years. Elizabeth had been by his side since the beginning. She had seen him through his humble beginnings, stood by him through sleepless nights and countless sacrifices as he clawed his way to the top. Her love had been sufficient, her belief in him unshakable. But as the years passed and his empire grew, so too did the distance between them. The man who once saw Elizabeth as his rock, his greatest confidant, now saw her as a symbol of the life he was desperate to leave behind. And so, in a moment that would forever alter the course of both their lives, James made his decision. With a cold finality, he scrawled his name at the bottom of a letter, one that would serve as his only explanation to the woman who had given him everything. He couldn't bear to face her, to see the pain in her eyes, the inevitable heartbreak that would follow. So he opted for the coward's way out. A letter, a brief clinical goodbye, and a plan to leave while she was out, ensuring there would be no confrontation, no desperate pleas to reconsider. That night, James packed a small suitcase, careful to take only what he needed for the immediate future. He left behind the trappings of their life together, the wedding photos, the shared mementos of trips and holidays, the evidence of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. As he walked out of the door of their mansion, the one they had built together with dreams of a family and a future, he didn't look back. The sound of the door closing behind him was final, echoing in the silence of the empty hallway. Elizabeth returned home that night, her heart lightened by the thought of a quiet evening with her husband. But as she stepped through the front door, she was greeted by an unusual stillness. The house felt empty in a way it never had before. She called out for James, expecting to hear his voice from another room, but there was no reply. Puzzled, she wandered through the house, her steps quickening with a growing sense of unease. It wasn't until she reached his study that she saw the letter neatly folded on the desk where he had sat so many nights planning their future. Her name was written on the outside in his familiar handwriting. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper and began to read. Each word felt like a dagger to her heart, the finality of his decision hitting her like a physical blow. Elizabeth sank to the floor, the letter slipping from her fingers as the reality of what she had just read set in. James was gone. He had left her with nothing but a cold, impersonal letter explaining his need for freedom and his desire to pursue new opportunities. The love they had shared, the vows they had made, had been discarded as if they meant nothing. The days that followed were a blur of grief and disbelief. Elizabeth couldn't comprehend how the man she had loved so deeply could have done this to her. She had always known James was ambitious, that his drive for success sometimes bordered on obsession, but she had never imagined it would lead him to abandon her. The life they had built together, the dreams they had shared, were now ashes at her feet. Financially, Elizabeth was left in a precarious position. James had always managed their finances, and with him gone, she found herself struggling to understand the complexities of their investments and assets. She had no access to the wealth that had once surrounded her. Bills began to pile up, and Elizabeth, once the elegant wife of a millionaire, now found herself selling jewelry and personal belongings just to keep the lights on. Loneliness engulfed her. Friends they had once socialized with disappeared, unsure how to deal with the scandal of James's sudden departure. Elizabeth's attempts to reach out to him went unanswered. Her calls went straight to voicemail, her texts remained unread. She wrote letters, hoping for some response, some explanation, but they were never returned. James had cut her out of his life completely, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that suddenly felt cold and unforgiving. And yet, despite the crushing weight of abandonment, something within Elizabeth refused to break. As the months passed, her grief began to harden into a quiet determination. She would not let James's betrayal define her. She would rebuild her life, piece by piece, even if it took everything she had. Elizabeth Palmer was no longer the wife of a millionaire, but she was still standing, and she would find a way to survive. 10 years had passed since that fateful night when James Palmer had walked out on his wife. leaving her with nothing but a cold, clinical goodbye letter. In those years, James had built an even greater empire, amassing wealth and power beyond what he could have imagined when he first decided to leave. But with each passing year, the hollow feeling inside him grew stronger. Success had brought him everything he thought he wanted: luxury, status, and freedom. But something vital was missing, something he couldn't name. The airport was busy with the usual energy of a weekday morning. Travelers hurried through the terminals, dragging their luggage, rushing to catch flights or finding seats to wait out long layovers. James sat in the VIP lounge, sipping a cup of coffee and glancing at the financial news on his tablet. It was a routine he had grown used to, traveling for business meetings in different cities, the same predictable cycle of work and solitude. But today, as he looked out over the crowd of people, something caught his eye that made his heart skip a beat. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but as he focused on the figure moving through the terminal, there was no mistaking it. There, just a few yards away, was Elizabeth, his ex-wife. His heart raced as he took in her appearance. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, with a confidence and poise that seemed to radiate from her. Her long hair was swept back, and she wore a simple yet elegant dress that accentuated her natural grace. She looked like a woman who had found her place in the world, who had not only survived but thrived. James was so stunned that he didn't notice the young man walking beside her until they stopped in front of a cafe. The young man's profile came into view as he turned to say something to Elizabeth, and James felt a jolt of recognition that sent a chill down his spine. The boy, no, the young man, had the same strong jawline, the same sharp eyes that James saw every morning in the mirror. The resemblance was unmistakable. Time seemed to freeze as James watched them. Elizabeth smiled warmly at the young man, the kind of smile that spoke of years of shared moments, of a deep bond that only a mother and son could have. James felt his breath catch in his throat. This had to be his son. His son. The one he never knew existed. The one he had abandoned without a second thought when he left Elizabeth all those years ago. The realization hit him like a freight train, bringing with it a tidal wave of emotions that he hadn't felt in years. Regret, guilt, and a deep, gnawing sorrow for everything he had lost, for everything he had thrown away in his pursuit of wealth and freedom. The life he had chosen over them now seemed like an empty shell, devoid of meaning, and the reality of what he had sacrificed for it was staring him in the face. He watched as the young man reached out to hold Elizabeth's hand, a gesture so natural and loving that it made James's heart ache. He had missed everything: his son's first steps, his first words, all the moments that should have been his to cherish. He had no right to feel this way, yet the pain was overwhelming, more intense than anything he had ever felt in his life. How could he have been so blind? How could he have walked away from this? As the minutes ticked by, James remained rooted to his seat, torn between the urge to run to them and the fear of what he might find. What would he say to Elizabeth, to the son he never knew? How could he possibly make up for all the years he had missed, for all the hurt he had caused? The reality of what he had done settled heavily on his shoulders, pressing down with an unbearable weight. Elizabeth and the young man chatted animatedly, oblivious to the man watching them from the distance. Every laugh, every smile they shared cut deeper into James's soul, a reminder of the life he could have had, the love he had forsaken. He had spent the past decade building an empire, yet here in this airport, surrounded by people rushing to catch flights, he felt like the poorest man in the world. A flood of memories washed over him. The day he first met Elizabeth, their wedding, the early years of their marriage when every day felt like a new adventure. He remembered how she had always believed in him, how she had stood by him even when times were tough. And then he remembered the look on her face the last time he saw her, the hurt he had caused, and the way he had walked away without looking back. James's heart pounded in his chest as he finally made a decision. He had to talk to them. He had to know the truth, had to see if there was any way to bridge the chasm that he had created between them. With a deep breath, he stood up, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He wasn't sure what he was going to say or how he was going to say it, but he knew that this might be his only chance to make things right. As he walked toward them, his mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What if they didn't want to talk to him? What if they had moved on completely, leaving no place for him in their lives? The fear of rejection gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. He had to face this. He had to face them. When he was just a few steps away, Elizabeth turned and met his eyes. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. She recognized him instantly, her expression shifting from surprise to something more complicated, an emotion he couldn't quite read. The young man turned to look at him as well, his eyes narrowing in confusion as he glanced between his mother and the stranger who had suddenly appeared before them. James swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He was about to speak, to say something, anything, when Elizabeth's face softened into a look of quiet resolve. She stepped forward, placing a hand on her son's shoulder, and the two of them stood together, waiting for him to make the next move. The moment of truth had arrived, and as James looked at them, the words he had rehearsed in his mind suddenly seemed inadequate. This wasn't just a reunion. This was the beginning of something that would change all their lives forever. James stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat as he faced Elizabeth and the young man beside her. He was so close now, close enough to see the faint lines around Elizabeth's eyes, lines that hadn't been there when he left, but that now only seemed to add to her grace and maturity. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to find the right words to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Elizabeth, he finally managed to say, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. Elizabeth didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. The young man at her side watched the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, his eyes flicking back and forth between the two of them as they're trying to piece together a puzzle. James could see the resemblance now, clear as day. The same sharp features, the same piercing gaze that had once helped him climb to the top of the business world. It was like looking into a mirror of his younger self. James, Elizabeth said at last, her tone measured, almost cautious. There was no warmth in her voice, but neither was there the anger or bitterness he had feared. She was composed, controlled, so different from the woman he had left behind all those years ago. She had changed in ways he hadn't expected, and that realization made his chest tighten with regret. Before James could say anything more, the young man spoke up. Mom, who is this? His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a protective tone that made James's heart ache even more. He was protecting her, guarding her from a man who was now little more than a stranger. Elizabeth hesitated for a brief moment, her eyes never leaving James's. This is James Palmer, she said finally, with an air of quiet finality. She didn't add anything else, didn't explain who he was to her or why this meeting was significant. The silence that followed was deafening. The young man's expression hardened as he processed her words. Palmer? You mean? His voice trailed off as the pieces began to fall into place, the realization dawning on him slowly, painfully. He looked at James with newfound intensity, his eyes narrowing. You're my father. James felt the air rush out of his lungs as if he'd been punched in the gut. Hearing those words he had feared and longed to hear all at once, hit him with the full weight of his actions, the gravity of what he had done. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? How could he explain leaving, abandoning his own flesh and blood without ever knowing of his existence? The young man, his son, stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Where have you been? He asked, his voice trembling slightly, betraying the emotions he was clearly trying to keep in check. All these years, why did you ever come back? James's throat tightened as he struggled to find the right words. I didn't know, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know about you. The young man's jaw clenched. Didn't know? Or didn't care? You walked out on us, didn't you? He could feel the judgment in his son's eyes, the pain behind every word. It's not that simple, James said weakly, knowing how hollow the words must sound. I made mistakes. I thought I was doing what was best at the time, but I see now how wrong I was. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Elizabeth remained silent, watching the exchange with a calm detachment that unnerved him. He wanted to see something in her eyes. Anger, sadness, anything. But there was nothing. Just the same steady gaze as she stood beside their son, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The young man shook his head, his disappointment palpable. You don't get to just say you're sorry and expect everything to be okay. You left us. You left asterisk care asterisk, he gestured toward Elizabeth, who remained stoic, her expression unchanged. I know, James said, his voice thick with emotion. I can never undo what I did, but please let me make it right. Let me be a part of your life now, if you let me. There was a long pause as the young man studied him, searching his face for any sign of sincerity. Finally, he turned to Elizabeth, seeking her guidance. Mom? He asked softly, the hardness in his voice fading as he looked to her for direction. Elizabeth met her son's gaze, and for the first time James saw a flicker of emotion cross her face, After a moment, she turned back to James, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. It's not up to me, James, she said softly. It's up to him. I've moved on with my life. I found peace. But if he wants to know you, if he's willing to give you a chance, that's his decision. James nodded, swallowing hard as he turned back to his son. I want to know you, he said, his voice trembling. I want to be there for you, for whatever time we have left. I know I don't deserve it, please. Just give me a chance. The young man was silent for a long moment, the conflict clear on his face. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet, but maybe we can start with that. A sense of relief washed over James, mingled with the lingering pain of regret. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was something, an opening, a possibility. As he looked into his son's eyes, he knew this was only the beginning of a long journey, one that would take time, patience, and a lot of healing. But for the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt hope. James stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, struggling to process everything that had just happened. The realization that he was standing in front of his own son, a son he never knew he had, left him reeling. He searched Elizabeth's face for any hint of how she might be feeling, but her expression remained unreadable, a mask of composure that only deepened his sense of dread. Finally, Elizabeth broke the silence, her voice soft but unwavering. There's more you need to know, James. Things I couldn't say before. Things I didn't have the chance to tell you. James's breath caught in his throat. He had suspected as much, the lingering questions gnawing at him ever since he had first laid eyes on the young man beside her. He nodded, bracing himself for whatever revelation was to come. Elizabeth glanced at their son, who looked back at her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. She took a deep breath before speaking again. After you left, she began, her voice carrying the weight of years of unresolved pain. I found out I was pregnant. The words hit James like a sledgehammer, knocking the wind out of him. He had feared this, the possibility that his actions had left a trail of destruction far greater than he had imagined. But hearing it now, spoken aloud, made it all too real. I didn't know what to do at first. Elizabeth continued, her eyes clouded with memories. You were gone, and I had no way of reaching you. I was scared, alone, and completely unprepared. But I knew I had to be strong for him. She glanced at their son again, and James saw the flicker of a smile, a rare glimpse of tenderness in her otherwise stoic demeanor. James could barely speak, his voice choked with guilt. Elizabeth, I'm so sorry. I never knew. I should have been there for you. I should have. But you weren't. Elizabeth cut him off, her tone firm but not unkind. You weren't there, James. I had to do it all on my own. Every doctor's visit, every sleepless night, every time he got sick or needed help with school. I did it by myself. Her words were like a knife to his heart, each one a reminder of everything he had missed, everything he had abandoned. James could barely hold her gaze as she spoke, the shame of what he had done overwhelming him. I didn't know how we would survive. Elizabeth continued, her voice softening slightly. But we did. We made it through somehow. I found work, moved to a smaller place, and did everything I could to give him a good life. It wasn't easy, but we made it. James' eyes filled with tears as he listened, the full impact of his actions crashing down on him. How could he have been so blind, so selfish, to leave her to face this all alone? The thought of Elizabeth struggling to raise their son without any help or support was almost too much to bear. Elizabeth, I want to make it right, James said, his voice trembling. I know I can never undo what I did, but please let me help now. Let me be there for both of you. I can provide financial support, anything you need. I just want to be a part of your lives. But Elizabeth's expression didn't change, her eyes steadied as she looked at him. It's not that simple, James, she said quietly. You can't just throw money at this and expect everything to be okay. We've built a life without you, a life we're proud of. It wasn't easy, but it's ours. James swallowed hard, the desperation in his chest growing stronger with every passing second. I know that, but I want to be there now, if you'll let me. I want to get to know him, to be the father he deserves. I'll do anything, whatever it takes. Elizabeth's gaze softened. There was still a hardness beneath it, a protective instinct that had been honed over years of doing everything herself. You can't buy your way into our lives, James. This isn't about money. It's about trust, about being there when it matters. And right now, he doesn't know if he can trust you. James looked at his son, who had remained silent during the exchange, his expression unreadable. The young man met his gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and uncertainty. It was clear that he was struggling to make sense of everything, to reconcile the image of the father he had never known with the reality of the man standing before him. I don't want your money, the young man said finally, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I just want to know why you left, why you didn't come back. James's heart broke at the question, the pain in his son's voice like a dagger to his soul. How could he explain the selfishness, the fear, the overwhelming need to escape that had driven him to leave? How could he possibly make his son understand that his decision had been one of the greatest mistakes of his life? I was a fool, James admitted, his voice thick with regret. I thought I needed freedom, that I had to chase success and wealth at all costs. I convinced myself that leaving was the right thing to do, that I would be better off on my own. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. The young man listened, his expression unreadable, but James could see the struggle in his eyes. He wanted to believe his father, wanted to forgive him, but the years of absence, the pain of abandonment, were not so easily forgotten. I know it will take time, James continued, his voice shaking with emotion. But please let me try. Let me show you that I'm not the same man who walked out on you. Let me earn your trust. Elizabeth watched their exchange, her heart aching for her son, for the man she had once loved, and for the years they had all lost. She wanted to protect her son, to shield him from any more pain, but she also knew that this was a decision only he could make. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the young man nodded, his eyes filled with a cautious hope. We'll see, he said quietly. We'll see if you're serious about this. It wasn't a promise of forgiveness, but it was a start, a small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could begin to heal the wounds of the past. As James looked at his son, he knew that this was his chance, a chance to make things right, to be the father he had always wanted to be. And he would do whatever it took to prove that he was worthy of it. The silence hung between them, heavy and charged with emotions that had been buried for far too long. James felt his heart pounding in his chest, every beat echoing the fear and desperation he was trying to hide. His son had agreed to give him a chance, but the caution in his voice, the guarded look in his eyes, made it clear that this was not a moment of forgiveness. It was merely an opening. A door cracked just enough for James to glimpse what he had lost. Elizabeth stood beside her son, her expression unreadable as she watched the exchange. James knew that she had already moved on from him, that her life had been rebuilt without him in it. But standing here now, he couldn't help but wonder what could have been different, how much pain he could have spared them both if he hadn't been so blind, so consumed by his ambition. I know I don't deserve this chance, James said, his voice thick with emotion, but I'm going to do everything I can to earn your trust. I want to be a part of your life if you'll let me, and I understand if it takes time. I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. His son didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at James with an intensity that made it clear he was weighing every word, every gesture. There was a wisdom in his eyes that seemed beyond his years, a maturity that spoke of the hardships he had endured, the lessons he had learned in the absence of a father's guidance. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but tinged with the hurt he was still grappling with. I'm not going to pretend that I'm okay with everything, the young man said. You left us, and that's something I'm not sure I can ever fully forgive. But I've seen what my mom has gone through, how hard she worked to give me a good life, and I owe it to her to at least try to understand why you did what you did. But this isn't going to be easy. James nodded, feeling the weight of his son's words settle into his heart. I don't expect it to be, he replied, his voice soft but resolute. I just want the chance to show you that I'm not the same man who walked out all those years ago. I've made mistakes, but I want to make amends. I want to be there for you in whatever way you allow. The young man glanced at Elizabeth, seeking her silent approval, before turning back to James. If we do this, he said slowly, it's going to be on our terms. No grand gestures. No trying to buy your way back into our lives. You're going to have to prove that you've changed, that you really want to be a part of our lives. And if you can't do that, I understand, James said quickly, his tone sincere. I'll do whatever it takes. I'm not here to force anything. I just want to be given the chance to be the father I should have been all along. Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying the weight of years of unspoken hurt. It's not just about what you want, James. It's about what he needs. You need to be prepared for the fact that this might not work out the way you want it to. We've built a life without you, and we're not going to disrupt that just because you suddenly decided you want back in. James's throat tightened as he listened to her words, the reality of the situation sinking in deeper. He had missed so much, and now he was standing at the edge of a life that had moved on without him. hoping for a place in it. I don't want to disrupt anything, he said quietly. I just want to be a part of whatever you let me be a part of. His son studied him for a moment, and James could see the conflict in his eyes, the battle between wanting to protect his mother and the natural curiosity about the man who had given him life, who had suddenly reappeared after all these years. We'll take it one step at a time, the young man finally said. I'm not promising anything more than that. James felt a rush of relief, mixed with the pain of knowing how much he had to prove. It wasn't much, but it was a start, one that he was determined not to squander. Thank you, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Elizabeth gave a small nod, her expression softening just a fraction. We'll see how things go, she said, echoing her son's sentiment. But you need to understand, James, that this isn't about you making yourself feel better. It's about doing what's right for him and for me. I understand, James replied, his heart heavy but filled with a glimmer of hope. I'll respect whatever boundaries you need to set. The three of them stood in a tense silence for a moment longer, the weight of the past hanging between them. Finally, Elizabeth looked at her son, her expression gentle but firm. We should go, she said softly. We have a flight to catch. James's heart sank as he realized that this moment, this fragile, tenuous connection, was coming to an end. But he knew he couldn't push any further, not now. He had to let them go, had to trust that they would be willing to see him again, to continue this difficult journey toward reconciliation. Where are you headed? James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. New York, his son replied. I'm starting college there. James's heart swelled with pride and regret all at once. That's wonderful, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm really proud of you. The young man nodded, his expression softening just a bit. Thanks, he said, though his tone remained cautious. Elizabeth offered James a small, bittersweet smile. Take care of yourself, James, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of finality and the faintest hint of hope. You too, James replied, his voice barely audible. As they turned to leave, James watched them walk away, his heart aching with the knowledge of everything he had lost, and the small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he could begin to rebuild some of it. He stood there for a long time, watching until they disappeared into the crowd, his mind racing with thoughts of what the future might hold. He knew this was only the beginning. There would be no easy fixes, no quick resolutions to the pain and hurt he had caused. But as he turned to leave the airport, James felt the sense of determination settle in his chest. He would prove himself to them, show them that he was committed to being the father and man they deserved. It would take time, patience, and a lot of hard work. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had something worth fighting for. As he walked out of the airport, the sun setting on the horizon, James felt the weight of his past lift just a little. He had a long road ahead of him, one filled with challenges and the need for redemption. But he was ready to face it, ready to do whatever it took to make things right. And as he disappeared into the evening, he carried with him the hope that one day he might earn the love and trust of the family he had lost, and the chance for a new beginning built not on money or power, but on the strength of the relationships he had once taken for granted.